Oh, the media are talking a lot about this. Today, it marks the 50th anniversary of the infamous Watergate break-in, so-called because the plumbers and Nixon's goons, like G. Gordon Liddy and others, were involved in the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex, which this is the picture of, in Washington, D.C. And I was 17 years old when that story first broke. And I remember telling my mom, because I was really, for some years, following politics closely. And I told my mom, you know, Nixon's behind that. He's behind that. And you know what? I was right. I hate to say it, I was right. And I also remember a few months later telling a teacher in my social studies class, and I said, Nixon is, and this was coming up on the election in 1972, right? Where Nixon was considered a shoo-in over one issue opponent, George McGovern. And who was the end result of Nixon's dirty tricks, basically, his dirty trick squad. And I said, Nixon is either going to be impeached or resign. This was almost 2 years before he resigned. And I was right there. But the Watergate break-in was very much misunderstood because so much of the stuff was not available to historians, not really available to anybody at the time. What was the purpose of it? Because if Nixon was such a shoo-in for re-election, why did they need to go into his people needed to go in and do that break-in? It didn't make sense. But when you understand the backstory of this thing, Nixon, it wasn't really a sure thing that Nixon was going to get reelected in the early going in 1971. That all the war in Vietnam was still raging and all this, and there were lots of riots and student protests and all of this. And so it wasn't really, it wasn't really a slam dunk for Nixon. So the Dirty Trick Squad engaged in a lot of dirty tricks to try to get rid of some of the more stronger candidates, especially Ed Muskie. And they succeeded in their wildest dreams about Muskie and those people. And they got the person they wanted to run against Nixon, which was George McGovern, who was one of the weakest candidates. But that's only part of the story. That doesn't even really explain it, because there was still a lot not known. And so a lot of people just couldn't figure it out, even then. Why? But Nixon had something to hide. And I've talked about Nixon in connection with Donald Trump, and people say, well, Donald Trump was the worst. Well, he was pretty damn bad. I mean, it's almost a photo finish between him and Nixon for being the worst. But Nixon, I still say, gets the edge because he was a war criminal. He and his buddy, Henry Kissinger, were quite literally war criminals. And the reason I say that, and both should have been tried at The Hague, the reason I say that is because I've talked about this, that now, the Nixon tapes are being more and more available to the public, and more documents are being available to historians. We can see really what the motive was, and why Nixon was so hell-bent on not releasing the tapes and all the documents. He stonewalled that till he died. Till the day he died. Well, he had something to hide, as we've talked about. And that had to do with his sabotaged through third parties the Paris peace talks in 1968. And I remember as a little girl, or young girl, early adolescence, about the Tet Offensive and all that. And that was the low point of the Vietnam War, our involvement in it. And LBJ decided not to run for re-election. And there were always some kind of theories there that he wouldn't win re-election. Or I heard that because of his heart issues, because he died right after what would have been his second term, the end of his second term in 1973, which was the day of Roe v. Wade being decided, January 22nd. And so there was all this speculation why LBJ didn't run. But we know why LBJ didn't run nowadays, because we have the LBJ tapes. And they're damning. But he wanted to end the war in Vietnam because he knew it was unwinnable. The South Vietnam was going to fall eventually. They couldn't keep propping that up. And so he wanted to finally hammer out an agreement in Paris to end the war. So peace was at hand. And I'd heard that. And then everything was going pretty good. And then all of a sudden, right before the 68 election, it fell apart. And the theory went on for years and years about Nixon sabotaging the Paris peace talks. I think as early as 1969 it came out with, I think Jack Anderson he was a journalist, had kind of a muckraking journalist, and he'd come out and had talked about this Chenault affair. And Chenault, of course, Anna Chenault was a Republican activist, and her husband, late husband, was a Republican activist, and he had been a military man. And she was very much pro-Taiwan and, all this kind of stuff, very anti-communist. But she was willing to work with South Vietnamese officials to tell them, oh, don't agree to this, that Nixon will offer you a better deal, in effect. And because of the South Vietnamese, they decided, the representatives, they decided, oh, we aren't going to agree to this, and the whole damn thing fell apart, and Nixon got elected. Now, why did Nixon, and it's all proven now that this happened. This is no longer rumor. It's beyond a doubt. Anna Chenault, who died a few years ago, she confirmed it. Another person that was there at the meetings and stuff, he confirmed it. And then John Mitchell, I think, was involved in it. And there might have been other people, connected to Nixon that were involved in it. But in any case, the Paris peace talks fell apart. Well, the problem was Nixon had no business going in there having anything to do with that, because he was a private citizen. And therefore, there was a real possibility he violated the Logan Act. So in effect, he did kind of commit treason against the United States by, through third parties, sabotaging the Paris peace talks. And this isn't even mere theory, because there are the LBJ tapes where LBJ is talking to then Senate leader or minority leader Everett Dirksen of what he knew he was on to him, because he had him wiretapped, which was illegal, which is one of the reasons he didn't pursue it. Why he didn't get the goods on Nixon at the time of all this Watergate stuff right before he died. He had the goods on Nixon, but because he illegally wiretapped, well, that wouldn't have been a good thing. So he was worried about that. So there it is. He knew Nixon was pulling this shit. And the thing is, LBJ went on the record of saying he thought Nixon would win election. If Nixon had just done what any normal person had done, and just talked and worked with LBJ and all this after the election and so forth, or even up to the election, to hammer out this agreement, history would have been so much different. It would have been so much different. You know, and Nixon would have been, you know, home free. It would have been peace and all this kind of crap. And the good things that Nixon did do, and he did do good things when he was president, people would call him a very good president. But no, he had that character flaw. He had that character flaw, or character flaws of paranoia and hatred toward his enemies. And he thought Nixon was, or not Nixon, but LBJ was playing politics with the election, which he was not. He thought he was hammering out all this stuff at the Paris peace talks in order to help Hubert Humphrey get elected. But that was not true. That LBJ wasn't doing that, because he figured Nixon was going to get elected. So there you are. Nixon's hatred is what fueled that Chennault affair. Nixon's desire for revenge fueled that Chennault affair. But he found out through Dirksen, apparently, and others, that LBJ knew about it. And so LBJ had all this info, all this dirt on him. And so Nixon spent really his whole administration, things like the Pentagon Papers, things like Watergate, all this illegal shit that he was doing, he was afraid of being exposed as a traitor or committing treason or violating the Logan Act on that Chennault affair. And so he was going around trying to find out what the Democrats had. And he wanted to know where those files were that LBJ had. And find out, well, when LBJ left office, he entrusted him to a man named Walter Rostow, who kept him down in Texas. Nixon was looking all over Washington for those files. But actually, Walter Rostow had them. And eventually they were turned over to the LBJ library, I believe. And that's where people like historians and writers like Robert Parry were talking about the truth about Watergate and all of that. So this is kind of roundabout, and I'll go ahead and link this. Robert Parry died in 2015 at age 68, and he was a pretty good journalist. Sometimes he wasn't correct on everything, but he talks about the story here about what it was. And there also is that book called Chasing Shadows, which focused on the Nixon tapes. It was written by a historian, and the LBJ tapes, which are even more damning than the Nixon tapes. And I will provide a link to a couple of the, they're on YouTube, of the phone calls that LBJ made to, well, one in particular. I'll do the one in particular. It says this is treason, to Everett Dirksen. But there's no doubt the Chennault affair happened. There's no doubt, Watergate happened. But they go together. And why do they go together? Because of Vietnam. And what happened there, Nixon promised a better deal to the South Vietnamese and all this stuff. But what he did, though? He dragged that war out. It went on and on and on and on and on. Another 4 years. Look at all of those civilians that died in Southeast Asia. Look at all the American military that died and were wounded and were left with PTSD and all of that. Look at what happened there. They all died for nothing. All those people, hundreds of thousands of people, died for nothing. Just so Nixon could get reelected. Because he dragged that out. He dragged that war out for political reasons. That's the scandal there. And always Nixon was worried about being exposed for having sabotaged the Paris peace talks. And then by the election of 1972, yeah, now they were finally getting an agreement that was almost identical to the one that LBJ had hammered out back in 1968. But this was to help Nixon politically. See, this was what Watergate was about. It was all about Nixon getting reelected by knocking out his political enemies and having a relatively easy candidate to beat, which McGovern only carried Massachusetts, I think, and D.C. And also, he hid what he was really trying to find out. Who had the goods on him. Nixon had a reason to be paranoid. In other words, he had a reason. And it had to do with being exposed for having sabotaged the Paris peace talks. So, this is why what Nixon did is arguably worse than what Trump did. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to say, because Trump was pretty damn bad with that COVID, but that was, whatever. That was incompetence because he wasn't really qualified to be president in the first place. And then, of course, this Capitol Hill insurrection of basically overthrowing an election in a violent term. And it's going to be, if somehow Biden gets reelected, or other Democrat gets elected in 2025, what's it going to be like then? So that's pretty damn bad. So Trump comes a pretty close second to Nixon. But it wasn't a war that almost destroyed the United States. And the United States never recovered from Vietnam. The Vietnam debacle. And to me, in my view, if you're going to sit there and you're going to stretch out a war to ensure your re-election, which is what all of that was about, if you're going to do that, you should have been tried at The Hague. Not by Congress, and resign and they get pardoned. No, the real thing you should have had was be tried at The Hague. And so therefore, I'm kind of rambly here because I don't have a script. So therefore, I still say Nixon was the worst president we ever had. So Watergate, it could be talked about, that this was this 2-bit break-in and all that. But it was one episode. Oh, be quiet. It was one episode in the long story of Nixon trying to... Would you be quiet? Nixon trying to play CYA. Not CIA, CYA. I had to throw that to get her to be quiet. So anyway, that's all I have to say about Nixon and Watergate and the anniversary and all that.